sometimes in translation theory, there's a bit of a tendency to be like, translation is good, it is a source of creation, or translation is bad, it is a technology of governance. And I'm trying to think about the ways in which both of those things are true and both of those things are informed by the other. That's a sort of, this is a practice. It can be used in multiple ways, but I think it's important that we understand all of those ways together. As a sort of new way of thinking about translation, I think it's that.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Hannah Scott Deuchar discusses the impact of translation on politics and power. Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Sam Lupowitz, the media manager of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm here today with Hannah Scott Deuchar. Dr. Deuchar's research and teaching address modern Middle Eastern literature, media and translation, critical and legal theory, and histories of culture and technology in the global South. This past spring semester, she gave a talk as part of Cornell's Language and Power in the Middle East and Beyond series entitled Translational Justice, the Arabic Novel and the British Archive. We will discuss all this and more today on our podcast. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Hannah.
Hi, thank you.
Before we dive into the very interesting work you've been doing, I would love to hear about your background and path with languages. What does that look like for you?
Oh, sure. That's such a great question. I wish I'd thought about this before.
It's okay. We like to get a raw, unfiltered answer.
Yeah, I feel like it's a question which, sort of has multiple possible answers. I suppose one sort of early beginning is that my mother is bilingual, so she was a daughter of diplomats, and had, by her accounts, a sort of very miserable, I'm not sure that's entirely true, but a very miserable childhood, moving from country to country. And so she grew up really pretty multilingual. I think she speaks Italian, Norwegian, and she's bilingual English and French. So we heard a lot of French in the house when we were growing up. My father is very bad at French, so they didn't speak French together, but we heard it in the house, and our sort of bedtime stories and lullabies were in French. So although I was not a particularly hardworking student of languages, I had this enormous advantage in that I had sort of French in the house, and the accent and so forth was accessible to me. So I grew up. And my mother is also an absolute dictator when it comes to learning a second language. And so it was never an option that I didn't study a language, at least quite seriously, as a child and at school. Although I was also doing this in the British public education system, which is famously just so bad at teaching languages. So really in an effort to I guess to overcome how poor my languages were, which the sort of, they really were, to the extent that my mom would tend to greet my attempts to speak French to her with sighs and it's things like, what do they teach you in these schools? The state of languages in this country is in disgrace, etc., etc. So
very encouraging for you as a child.
Encouraging. I'm sure. It really gives you I always think of this in terms of mother tongue and the various traumas wrought on us by our parents in language. But perhaps I read it as you wish in an attempt to get past this. I studied languages at undergrad, and I was planning to go for for French and Spanish or English and French, and I ended up for various sort of convoluted reasons going for French and Arabic. Partly I was persuaded to do so by a family friend who is herself a translator from Arabic and sort of talked me into it. And partly, quite frankly, and perhaps I shouldn't admit this, because I was a strategic child and I wanted to go to Oxford. And I thought that the likelihood of my getting in for something obscure like Arabic and French was much higher than my getting in for something like French. And I was almost certainly right.
Yeah, those of us who were English majors in our undergraduate studies, yes, agree. Well, fantastic. So that's a great way to sort of set up the next question, which your work broadly concerns literature, media, technology, and translation in the modern Middle East. So what, you alluded to some of this already, what led you to your field of study and what inspires the work that you do?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, the the Arabic stuff is partly from this family friend, but I knew her because my father is a sort of. I'm really talking about my parents so much, but maybe this is this is fitting for like a discussion of language.
Right? Yeah. No. I'm sure there's something we can tie that to.
Yeah,
here.
I'm sure there's something we can infer from this. I think. But my father is a sort of neo-Orientalist, his words, and has this curious and maybe slightly suspect fascination with the Middle East, and so he spent a summer as a teenager on a kibbutz, and then went from the kibbutz into East Jerusalem and into Palestine, and sort of explored different sides of that question and that space.
As one does.
As one does. And so when we were children, we went back to the Middle East pretty often. And so I had some sort of, I mean, mostly, honestly, this was my father's choice. It was rigorously disputed by his children. As we got older, there are four of us. My father eventually agreed that perhaps we should be more democratic in choosing where we traveled as a family. And so he installed like a voting system, and the vote was 4 votes for Disneyland. That was us 4. And 1 vote for Yemen. And we went to Yemen. So.
Learning a helpful but perhaps disappointing lesson about functional democracy.
Which feels quite pertinent now. So.
Certainly.
So that sort of, I think many of these things collided. And then obviously sometimes what you choose, in England also we choose our major before we even go to university, and it's very hard to change it. So yes. I was kind of locked in with this double major of French and Arabic. And then while I was there, back in the olden days, betrays my age, the program that I was in, the Arabic program, sent its students in their second year for a full year either to Egypt or to Syria. And my cohort went to Syria, to Damascus. And that year was the year of the Arab Spring. Uh-huh. And so, so we were in Syria up to a certain point, after which, sort of at the same time as the Americans, we were told to leave, which was in, I believe, sort of January or February of that year. And I think so often people who study Arabic at my university go off to a sort of range of different careers, often which have nothing to do with Arabic, but every single person in my cohort actually ended up staying broadly in the field, working in NGOs or academia or media or various other sort of spaces, but most of them are still using Arabic and working or thinking with the Middle East. And I think that probably comes from having been there at a particularly exciting and extraordinarily exciting, and also in the aftermath often devastating time, and experiencing, in my case, not in most of my friends' case, but in my case, the sort of guilt and discomfort and defensiveness of being a white person who can leave.
Sure.
And when your friends can't, and all these sort of intense experiences, and thinking about what it means to be watching a radical and exciting political movement that is, to which you feel connected, but which is not yours to feel connected. So all of us, I think, or many of us, had a particularly intense experience in that year, and it seemed unthinkable to me 2 years later that I would stop studying these histories. Particularly, I was increasingly interested in the colonial histories that I just started to learn about. At the end of 4 years, I just sort of realized how exceptionally ignorant I was, and so graduate studies seemed sort of imperative. And then as I moved through the program, it became for me less about this sort of originary moment and much more about colonial histories and the ways in which writings in Arabic, particularly literary writings, are this sort of fount of theory, really, about colonization, about its effect on language, about power. This extraordinary untapped theoretical resource, really, not untapped, but sometimes unrecognized theoretical resource about, these things that we think are theorized in English, but in fact I think are theorized exceptionally strongly in Arabic. So that's a long-winded answer for you.
Long-winded, but detailed and informative, and so, which is what we love here. So moving on from that, in your first book, Translational Justice addresses translation's role in, and I'm quoting now, the making, administration, and contestation of colonial law. So what kind of power does the act of translation have on a global political stage?
What a beautiful question. I should say that that's the working title.
Okay.
I kind of hate it.
Okay.
I'm taking suggestions.
All right.
It's under contract, but they haven't yet affirmed the title. So if anybody has any suggestions,
Yes, all right, listeners.
them.
We'll make sure you know how to reach out to Hannah at the end of our episode.
So yeah, what kind of power does translation have on a global political stage? I think was the question. Yeah. So I mean, the book is really, really focused on law. I think that. Let me think about this. So I think when we, there are two main ways sort of colloquially of thinking about what translation is and how it functions. One, which we all functionally do, I don't separate myself from this, is that we dismiss it as a kind of technical process because it's actually, functionally it's in our lives all the time. If you're watching a show on Netflix, it might have subtitles.
Sure.
I'm sort of at a loss. I feel that it's everywhere. In the US, you see things in sort of multiple languages on the subway, on public transit. In the UK also, where we think of ourselves as monolingual spaces, but we are not. We are surrounded by we're surrounded by translation in the sense that you might often be speaking in English if you're speaking English to a non-native speaker of English who is doing some kind of translation in their head all the time. So translation is this sort of ubiquitous thing that we treat as a sort of see-through, transparent medium. The other way that it's so on a global political stage, it's like the grease in the wheels. There is no global politics without translation, right? That's the medium. Particularly translation into English. The way that it does sort of make its way into conversation, I think, is with sort of funny or weird mistranslations. The famous one, which I'm going to get horribly wrong, about the American politician who goes to Germany and calls himself a donut, right?
Right. Yes.
This kind of thing. So there are sort of like famous mistranslation stories.
Yes, we don't. I think if we had our usual resident German speaker here, she would be able to outline. But yes. I think it was.
My German accent is too horrible to ever be recorded, so I'm not going to attempt it.
Great. Well, and she's spared that until the episode comes out and she listens. So.
Brilliant. And so I feel like there's this sort of doubling where either translation is perfect and technical and everywhere, or it's this, flagrant mistranslations and they become these sort of surprising things. But some of what I'm writing about when I'm working with law is, what I look at in the book is the ways that law is a space in which translation is, I think, particularly ubiquitous. I focus on colonial law, so I look at colonial law in Egypt, which in the 19th century, kind of pre-existing system of Sharia law, so Islamic legal practices and texts, alongside Jewish and Christian law, which was also in place, which was mostly in Arabic, although Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, so there was also quite a lot of stuff kicking around in Ottoman Turkish. So this notion that translation comes in with European colonialism is part of the fallacy of monolingual nations that doesn't really make historical sense. Egypt was always this multilingual space, and in the law, translation was always there. But in the 19th century, suddenly these French legal codes are introduced. So French law becomes the basis for a new Egyptian law. Initially, they're used in French, and then they're translated into Arabic. And then the courts themselves are administered, these new secular courts using secular French law are administered in French, Italian, Arabic, and eventually English. So translation, you encounter it as soon as you go into the courtroom because everybody's speaking different languages. Lawyers are coming from all over the world, people who lived in Egypt. And I know that you've had Olga on this podcast already. So I'm assuming that people who are avid listeners will have learned from Olga already about the extraordinary multilingualism of Egypt. And the difference between Olga's work and my work, which is often speaking to each other, is that Olga is interested in this fact of multilingualism, and I am interested in the ways in which people tried to deal with it through translation, the ways in which you would overcome it, if you like, which is sort of through translation. So with the law, I'm making this argument in the book that the law is a space in which translation is particularly ubiquitous, and that it's not as simple as either translation functions perfectly and technically, or it's full of mistranslation. The point is not really it's not translation is bad and everything's a mistranslation, or translation is perfect. I'm interested in what does the fact that law is always already translated do to the power of law, which is a language? How do you interact with law when you're already a few steps away from that language? Yeah. I'm less interested in the mistranslations of individual legal cases, although there are many and they are flagrant.
Certainly.
And more in like what happens when this whole system is in translation. And just a last point is that I focus on colonial law, where necessarily because one set of people with their own language have invaded another space which has its own language or languages. And so translation is necessary. But, the French law that Egyptian law was translated from was itself a translation in many ways, both from Justinian law, which was in Latin, and the Napoleonic legal codes, which present themselves as this kind of timeless document of La France, right? Of France in its French language, are cobbled together from translations of Justinian, originally Latin law, and different French dialects. So they are always already translated, always already multilingual. So that, for me, is something that is not recognized enough by scholars of law in general, let alone colonial imperial law, where translation's presence is so flagrant.
Awesome. Great. So that's your book is forthcoming, but since we're talking now about getting down to real world incidents that how translation aids or damages these situations. Let's talk about your recent lecture on campus, which also the title that you're iffy on, Translational Justice, and subtitled The Arabic Novel and the British Archive.
Yeah.
You focus on a flashpoint event called the Deuchar Affair.
Yes.
So to start, can you give our listeners some background about this event?
Yeah, so the Deuchar Affair was this court case which took place in 1906 in British-occupied Egypt. So this is about 25 years into the British occupation of Egypt. And in this case, what had happened was that some British soldiers had been out in the Egyptian countryside. They were looking for pheasants to shoot. We are a nation that loves to hunt animals. And so they had been looking for pheasants to shoot for sport, and they had gone to this village called Deuchar, which they knew was famous for keeping pheasants, and they thought they had permission to enter the village. They actually didn't. It's unclear how that mistake occurred. There are various different versions, but it may have been a translation error. They thought they had permission to go into the village, so they started shooting the pheasants. The villagers objected. There was an altercation, and after the altercation, a British officer was found dead of sunstroke and blows to the head, and a villager was also found dead a little way off. In the next days, the death of the villager was investigated very briefly, and all of the British soldiers who had been accused of murder by the villagers were found completely innocent. The death of the British officer was also investigated, and it became this... it was sort of taken to court in something called a special tribunal, this multilingual legal tribunal, after which, 52 villagers were put on trial for the death of this officer. 4 of them were hanged, and many more of them were flogged and imprisoned for a crime that was deemed homicide with robbery. So this effectively meant that one British death had been met with 4 Egyptian deaths, to put it in crude sort of quantitative terms, along with 17 people being imprisoned and given hard labor or flogged. Flogging was actually a punishment that had been outlawed in Egypt, so the punishment itself was illegal. So it caused this enormous sort of global scandal, because the wild disproportion of the sentencing was such that people were outraged, not only in Egypt but further afield, and also because so partly the verdict and partly the trial itself, which was sort of run mostly by British judges, 3 British, 2 Egyptian, nominally run in Arabic, which is the only language the people on trial spoke, but in fact taking place in English, and with several of the judges not understanding any Arabic at all. So, and the fact of the kind of potential for mistranslation and the linguistic inequities of the trial were reported faithfully in the papers, and they became part of the scandal of the Deuchar Affair. So that for me was very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your abstract for the talk, you ask about how translation shaped Dinh Shui and how Dinh Shui might yet reshape conceptions of translation, justice, and reparation. Can you speak a bit more to that, to the cause and effect that you see? What can we learn from this example?
Yeah. So when I look at the Dinh Shui affair, something that I do that is sort of connected to my particular interest in translation, both as a creative and artistic and ubiquitous human practice on the one hand, and as a technology of legal governance on the other. So I try to look at it from both of those sides. So I read for translation in the documents of the court case. I look at how did translation show up at the file? Show up in the archival file? How did it show up in the courtroom? How do administrators use and think about translation? Do they know that they're using translation as a weapon, or is it a sort of unthinking process? And then alongside that narrative of the trial, right, like the archival narrative of the trial, I read this novel called The Maiden of Dinh Shui by a legal clerk called Mahmoud Tahir-Ha'i, which became a absolutely sort of bestseller of its time, which offers an alternative narrative of the trial, in which translation and mistranslation are sort of given the blame for all sorts of, for the verdict, for the incident itself. Like the novel really takes colonial translation to task, but in which translation also offers a space for the novel to try and theorize alternatives. So when I say that I think that Dinh Shui might help us rethink translation and justice and reparation, the first way is that by reading the novel and the court case together, I'm trying to make sense of, sometimes in translation theory, there's a bit of a tendency to be like, translation is good, it is a source of creation, or translation is bad, it is a technology of governance. And I'm trying to think about the ways in which both of those things are true, and both of those things are informed by the other. There's a sort of, this is a practice. It can be used in multiple ways, but I think it's important that we understand all of those ways together. So that's, as a sort of new way of thinking about translation, I think it's that. And then for thinking through justice and reparation, so my sort of aim in this talk is not to say like Dinh Shui was unjust. Like this is very clear. This is not, I don't need to like read all these documents to know that. I can just tell you in 3 sentences.
Yeah.
But what I'm interested in is, okay, if this took place in a trial and it was all perfectly legal, where then does justice happen? Like if we're in this context where the British, they're in Egypt, a lot of the British justification for their occupation of Egypt is that they're going to bring prosperity and rule of law to this space. So this Dinh Shui trial is an example of rule of law. It's a kind of it's the British bringing down the law.
Right.
So what do we do? How do people think about justice when they're looking at the courts and saying, okay, we've been promised equality and legal rule of law, and that is simply not happening in the courtroom? How do you think about justice then? What do you think justice is? Right? We use this term a lot, and I think that across different languages, and it does mean different things in different languages, different etymologies, right? Sure. There's often a sense of proportion, right? The bad thing has been met with something that the harm is an imbalance of some kind, and what is needed is to bring it back into balance. And you see this in like different modes of justice. So let's think like historic notions of what we would call in English blood money, where if a murder has occurred, let's say the family of the murdered person might be given money in some kind of compensation. It's a calculation of balance in some way, right? And so what was scandalous about the Dinh Shui affair was that for the British, the balance accorded for the loss of one British life was 4.
Yeah.
And it was this particularly stark way of quantifying, like 1 life equals 4 lives. But for the British, in some way, that that felt like balance. So what I find this is not I'm being long-winded because it's not a problem I particularly have an answer for.
Sure.
I talk about this with my students. For instance, last week I teach a course on justice. And this is at the end of the term, I'm like, okay, let's come back to justice. Like, what do we think this is? And one of my students really beautifully said, like, it's a feeling in my belly.
Oh.
Like, it's an instinct. It's an instinct. And then we talked about it was about feeling like, okay, enough. That's about right. A kind of instinctive return to balance, but a physical, emotional, so non-calculated, in fact. Like, if the law is a space in which we try to calculate what is proportional, what is appropriate, what is a kind of redress, that is that is what legal justice is trying to do by drawing on a code or precedent or any of these tools that we have to try and find, like, what is proportion. I was curious that my students was just sort of like, sure, it's calculation, it's all of those things, but it's a feeling in my belly. And then these scholars these novelists that I'm reading are going even further than that. So what I think they offer us for justice is at the end of the novel, the novelist is, and it's in a very complicated translation that I won't get into because I'll be here all day, but he writes a couple of times, mercy is higher than justice. So in Arabic, it's a rahma fo al-adl, and it's a mistranslation from Victor Hugo. So it's a mistranslation from French, about which I could say much. But the overall point, I think, is that the novelist ends not by rejecting colonial law. He ends by rejecting justice itself. And Adl in Arabic would mean, proportionate redress. I mean, it could mean many things, but at this point in the 19th century, it would mean like proportionate, equal redress, proportionate redress, balance is one of the etymologies of Adl. And instead of that, he wants rahma, which is precisely a kind of compassion that is disproportionate. So rahma is God's mercy, specifically. So it's divine, it's incalculable, it's precisely more than human. It's God's infinite mercy, right? So for me, what's interesting is that in turning this compassion or mercy is greater than justice. This could sound like a kind of pacifying response to a British injustice, like, don't rise up, folks. Don't be angry. Let's have mercy. Let's have compassion. Let's calm.
Right, of course.
But for me, it's almost the opposite of that. It's like, it's a vast rethinking of how you respond to harm. It's like, we don't even try to find equivalence. We are not looking for balance or proportion. We are looking for this, like, infinite force, like a divine mercy that is so incalculable and huge because its other side is God's wrath, right? So God can be so infinitely merciful because he or they could do the opposite. So in the talk, I was sort of thinking with Benjamin and notions of divine violence as the sort of side, like other side to rahma. But I think the takeaway for how we think about justice and reparation is, and I want to tread carefully here because reparations is such a big subject.
Sure.
But is that what I think you take from this novel is these systems of calculation and proportion are part of the problem in itself. The notion that these harms are redressable with some kind of proportionate response is wild. Like, what is the reparation for British colonialism? I mean, like, can you put a number on that? Which is not to say, if we wanted to talk about reparations, that I don't think material reparations are important or necessarily. I think they are essential, and I think the course of the 20th century has shown us that redress is important, and when it is not given, things compound themselves.
Right.
But I think that this move away from calculability and the law court is like a powerful thing to take from these texts.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So much to sit with and process from that. What a beautiful answer.
I could add, to bring it back to translation, that the connection for translation for me is that when we translate, we're also trying to calculate an equivalence, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I offer a translation of a word, I'm saying like, okay, like what is a balance for, I was looking for something and all I could see was my lips half, and that's not a good one. It's not a good example to offer. But if I'm trying to do a translation like of an idiom or something, I'm trying to find like, and there's lots in translation theory about equivalence is not possible. Sure, like we know that, but often what you're doing functionally when you're translating is trying to find an equivalence, and a proportion, and to calculate it, and particularly with AI and machine translation, often what's literally happening is a coding and a calculation,
right,
to come up with an equivalent. So it was interesting to me that you can think of translation and justice as kind of parallel imperfect processes for offering an equivalence that is impossible.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what the novel that I read is trying to say, or is trying to meditate on. Like, we're promised these systems of mediation, word for word, punishment for crime. If we acknowledge that they don't function, if we acknowledge also that the place of translation and law and giving of justice is exacerbating that impossibility, where then do we go? It's the kind of link there.
We had a Cornell professor on the podcast a couple of seasons ago, Caroline Levine, who was specifically here, spoke about translation in poetry. She was doing some work for the Norton Anthology of World Literature.
Cool.
And she presented us with an exercise that they included in the most recent anthology, which was 3 different translations over the span of, it was, I think, over a century or so, of the same Baudelaire poem.
Oh, cool.
And just the way that different translators approach the work based on form, based on, fidelity to the form in French as opposed to a form that would resonate in a similar way in English, and the different cultural backgrounds of the translators and the consideration of the cultural background of the subject of the poem, and all these sorts of things. And in poetry, it is so much about that balance between the literal and sort of the metaphorical and the heightened and the instinctive. And so that's me trying to tie it back to that balance of the calculated and the incalculable.
The incalculable, precisely. Yeah. Yeah, no.
I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think humanity is going to figure that out?
I don't. But I think, another sort of beautiful theorist of translation who I like a lot is Karen Emmerich, and she has this sort of notion of translation as this, there is no clear distinction between translation and original. Translation is this endless process of editing, rewriting, reproducing. So that's one way of thinking of it, that translation is a process rather than a product, right? It's an ongoing movement. Yeah.
Well, what other projects or events do you have coming up?
Thanks. Yeah, that's also a nice question. So my next project, oddly enough, is about the Arabic typewriter.
Oh.
So it's still about language, which is my ongoing obsession, but it's more material and visual. So I've written a little bit about the Arabic typewriter, and my next big sort of move is I'll be in Germany for the next year, in Berlin, with a Humboldt Fellowship, digging into some archives to try and find out about the history of the Arabic typewriter, which is unwritten. So we know almost nothing about the Arabic typewriter. Oh. And there may be nothing to know. I hate to say it, but perhaps no one's written it because there's nothing there, but I'm going to have a good look. And I go to DC next week to start that research in the Smithsonian.
Terrific. Well, I can't wait to see what comes from that. Where can our listeners find out more about you and your work? Keep up with whether it's, the typewriter or anything else.
I'm a Luddite, I'm afraid, so I'm not on social media.
Probably the best for your well-being, I'd say, at this stage. But
at this stage, I think that's the case. Although sometimes I wish I hadn't deleted everything. But for now, I'm not findable except through Google, and you find sort of department web pages and my academia.edu and all of those things.
Great. And we can link a few of those in the show notes.
For sure.
Certainly. Hannah, this has been wonderful. Such a treat to hear you talk about this. Before we sign off, though, we'd like to ask you for a word in a language you love, are learning, want to learn, that makes you feel inspired. What's a good word for you?
Also, such a great question. I was thinking about this on the way over, and I came up with, I don't know if I think it does make me feel inspired, but it's one of these words that you learn quite early, I think, as a student of Arabic. And it's like thrilling at 18 when you learn it for the first time. And I imagine, if I think if I were a native speaker, I would still love it. It's one of these several Arabic words which come from a quadrilateral root and are onomatopoeias. So there's a lot of them. One is kah. So an example would be kahkaha, which means to chortle or laugh. Uh-huh. Or balbala, which is sort of to disquiet. So it's to disquiet or stir up. But people also think that it's connected to the word Babel. So you'll get a phrase like tabalbol, and tabalbol al-alsina would be like the tabalbol of languages, like the babble of languages. That's an onomatopoeia. But okay, so I'm interested in these quadrilateral roots. So 4 consonants, these Arabic roots. And the one that I particularly love is waswasa, which is an onomatopoeia, which can mean sort of like whispering or hissing, but which is specifically connected to seditious whispering or hissing. So waswasa is like to speak under your breath or to whisper or to hiss, but with evil intention, probably. To prompt, to tempt. So we think of, you might hear waswasat ash-shaytan, which would be like the whispering of the devil. Ooh. And the devil himself is sometimes called al-wiswas, like he who tempts, he who whispers. And there's something about the tactileness of that word that's just like kind of delicious when you're learning a language and you're suddenly realizing that it opens up both a whole new kind of world of meanings and cultural experiences and all of those beautiful things, but also just like a new way of using your mouth and making sound.
And we're back to the concrete and the abstract.
Absolutely,
there.
That's beautifully put.
Perfect. Thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Hannah.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
We'll be back next week to talk with grammar guru Ellen Jovin and film director Brant Johnson about their film Rebel with a Clause. You can meet them both at the upcoming screening at Cinemapolis in Ithaca, New York on October 16th. Until then,
auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
And follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.